So good evening and welcome, everyone. I call the November 17th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting to order. The main purposes of tonight's meeting are a briefing on Public Works green infrastructure, a public hearing on code revisions regarding site plan submission, and a study session on expanded parking reduction code amendments. Before we move on to agenda items, I'd like to acknowledge our remote meeting format. As with our previous meetings, the Commissioners and the staff will be participating via Zoom. During this Zoom meeting, the chat and question functions will not be available for use to ensure with the Open Public Meetings Act. We have a public comment agenda item at the beginning of the meeting. This time is for comments on issues not on tonight's agenda. Please limit these comments to 3 minutes. Under Governor Inslee's Proclamation 20-28 regarding open public meetings, this meeting will be held remotely. Public comment will be allowed both in writing and orally. The Imagine Bothell notice, city website, and tonight's agenda all provided information to the public for providing comments. People wishing to comment were instructed to notify staff or provide written comments by 3 p.m. today. The video of this meeting will be streamed live as well as recorded and available later on the city's YouTube channel. Call-in number was provided on the meeting agenda for members of the public who wish to call in by phone to listen to the live meeting. For our phone-in callers, excuse me, during staff presentations, staff will make every effort to specify which materials they are referencing so that everyone can follow along. Those who provided advance notice are able to make comments under the audience comment portion of the meeting. Email was encouraged as well and will be acknowledged. At this point, we'll take a moment to acknowledge the attendance of commissioners. I'll go through it by position number. Commissioner Dodd.
Present.
Commissioner Westerbeck.
Here.
Commissioner Curd.
Here.
Commissioner Robeson is absent and excused and may be joining us later. Commissioner Alderks.
Present.
And Commissioner Gustafson.
Here.
Great. In addition, Community Development Director Michael Cotterman, Senior Planners Dave Boyd and Nathan Lamb, Janet Gear, Supervising Surface Water Engineer, and Jeff Smith, Development Services Manager, are in attendance. So welcome to all of you to our meeting. Lastly, before we begin, I'd like to reiterate some guidelines. For all meeting attendees, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking and mute when you're done, or unmute when you wish to speak. If you are also streaming the live video feed, please turn the sound off as there is a delay. For commissioners, at specific breaks in the presentation, I'll be calling on members who wish to speak or ask a question. If you want to speak, please indicate this by holding up yellow speaker cards in the corner or otherwise get my attention. I will call on you as I see you, and this will help avoid the problem of having 2 people speaking at the same time. Identify yourself before you ask a question, make a motion, second a motion, or participate in debate. And please mute your microphone when not speaking. So moving on to this evening's agenda, the first item on the agenda is public comment. Keeping with Governor Inslee's Emergency Proclamation 20-28 regarding public gatherings and open public meetings, the city accepted visitor comment in writing as well as accepted sign-up sheets for those who wish to speak at tonight's meeting. Written comments submitted to staff no later than 3 p.m. today were forwarded to all commissioners and are part of the record, though we have not received any. And this time is for meeting items not on tonight's agenda. Director Cotterman, please let us know if there are any comments received or any individuals wishing to comment.
No comments received, Mr. Chair, and no one in the attendee room.
All right, then, thank you. We'll close this item and move on to the next. The next item before us is the approval of the minutes. We have before us the minutes of the November 3rd meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I move to adopt the minutes as written for the previous meeting.
All right, Commissioner Westerbeck has moved to adopt. I think I saw Commissioner Alderks also raise her hand. Would you like to second? Okay, it has been moved and seconded to adopt the minutes of the November 3rd meeting. Is there any discussion around those minutes? Seeing none, scanning our folks here. All in favor of adopting the minutes? And I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All 6 commissioners do move to adopt the minutes. So the minutes are adopted as proposed to us. Thank you all. Moving on to the next agenda item, it is new business. And the first item of new business is the Public Works Green Infrastructure presentation. A lot of us are really looking forward to hearing from this. So Director Cotterman, would you like to introduce this?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Very much appreciate Janet Gear being here this evening. Janet is with our Public Works Department in the Stormwater Division. And she's here to give the Planning Commission some information about green infrastructure and all the work that's already being done in the city to encourage more green infrastructure. This is an item that came up in discussion around Canyon Park when we were looking at the bonus incentive program that Senior Planner Lamb has brought to the commission a couple of times. And at that time, the commission decided not to include it necessarily in the bonus incentive program, but you still had a lot of interest in what the city's already doing. And so in the future, if we do decide to go back and include that, we'll have a good starting point for that discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Janet and say thank you for joining us tonight, Janet. Do you want to go ahead and share your presentation?
Certainly. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen here. And as Mike had mentioned, I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. So can you let me know if you can see the presentation?
We got it.
Okay, perfect. Well, I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to talk about what we're doing already, especially focusing on that low impact development or green stormwater infrastructure piece, and then talk about some of the things that we're considering right now and things that we're going to bring to you in the future so that you can decide where and when you want to discuss these items. So just to give everybody on the group a little background so that we're all in the same place. I know there's some various levels of knowledge out there. So stormwater is the #1 source of pollution in our nation's waterways, local streams, and Puget Sound. And for this reason, the federal government sent requirements to each state through the Clean Water Act, which comes to the local jurisdictions in the form of a municipal stormwater permit. Those permits have requirements for us to reduce our stormwater impacts to our streams through a variety of several planning, programmatic, and development requirements. In order to address these, we have a stormwater comprehensive plan, which we call our master plan, which lays out how we'll meet our federal, state, and local requirements, along with additional projects and programs that are requested by council, staff, and the Bothell community to improve our stream health conditions. Within the current municipal permit is a requirement to select a small basin area in the Bothell area and provide recommendations specifically to improve those stream conditions. But as I'm sure you know, it's problematic to implement improvements and restrictions in one small area. So our intention is to bring forward what we're doing now and then let you know our future considerations that will direct benefit to all Bothell streams. Many of these improvements are also multi-benefit, meaning they'll also help us to address things like climate change issues, environmental justice, and salmon recovery. So I'm going to go just a little bit into those items as well, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with those. So what we know as far as the climate impacts that we have to address as well is that UW has a climate impacts group that's developed and run a series of models to study impacts to stream flows in our region due to climate change. Their reports state that we should experience increased stream flows of up to 16% in the wintertime and decreased stream flows in the summer up to 38% due to reduced snowpack by 2040. This means we're going to experience an increase in stream flow during the winter when we have reduced stormwater capacity, and it will lead to localized flooding of streams and storm systems. Streams will also experience additional stress in the summertime due to those decreased flows and therefore higher concentrations of pollutants. These calculations don't factor in increased frequency and duration of heavy precipitation due to increased stormwater amounts to their intensity and to consecutive events, which are also predicted to increase by 11%, which we were just talking about. These rain events are getting more and more frequent, and they're in succession. Also, ambient air temperatures are due to increase during the summer months, which will lead to higher stream temperatures and therefore lower dissolved oxygen levels, which are going to impact our fish and wildlife. So what is being done now? One of the things that we're going to discuss mostly this evening is low impact development or green stormwater infrastructure, which is currently required to the maximum extent feasible. We're also focusing on retrofitting. And so what this means is these areas that aren't going to be subject to these LID or green stormwater infrastructure requirements via new or redevelopment, we're going to focus on projects and grant dollars to improve either flow control and or water quality treatment into existing systems. We're also taking a look at fish passage culverts and making sure that we install these to both protect streams and reduce flooding to public and private property. These projects are really expensive, and so we have it in our plan and in our budget. They just move on a slightly slower schedule into our capital facilities plan to allow for adequate utility and grant funding dollars. So to expand on the low impact development, green stormwater infrastructure. So we have adopted the King County Surface Water Design Manual. And what this means is that every development that comes in, new or redevelopment, has got to go through the manual and make sure they meet all of the requirements within. For flow control, they have to match that to forested conditions. So what that means is when a project comes in, it doesn't matter if that project has 100% impervious surface, they have got to make calculations according to as though it's a forested area. They also have to implement water quality treatment to remove pollutants. And there's a provision which is under Core 9 for additional flow control. And what that means is they have to implement low impact development to what we call the maximum extent feasible, and they have to be able to demonstrate that to us. Otherwise, they have to provide additional flow control, which is often more expensive. And so what this basically means is that the techniques you're talking about, rain gardens, pervious pavements, infiltration trenches, a host of other proprietary systems and other techniques are already required, and they're being installed now on any projects that are coming in. So with that, talking about some of the other considerations that we're looking at right now, in order to address current and future impacts that we've discussed, we need to increase our stormwater flow control in winter months to hold back more water and to slow it down to allow those streams more time to recover during these rain events. We can accomplish this by increasing the amount of water development projects are required to detain. So when they go through that list and have to detain deforested conditions, we need to make sure that those numbers are correct. And increasing vegetation to take up more water and shade those streams during the warmer summer, drier months. So to explain this a little bit, our stormwater isopluvials, in order to address the increase for stormwater detention, we're proposing to update the amount of precipitation that developers are required to use in those models for their stormwater detention systems. What you see here is the 24-hour rainfall amounts that are currently used in our design manual. These stormwater flows are displayed in inches and are over a 24-hour period and do not account for previous rain events. What we've been experiencing over the last 10 years is an increase in multiple rain events in rapid succession, meaning that our stormwater systems have not had time to drain before receiving new amounts of precipitation. This table shows the number of times we've exceeded the current design standards over the past 10 years during a 24, a 48, and a 72-hour period. As an example, the multiple localized flooding events we've experienced recently from 2019 to now were never more than a 10-year event, but they're preceded by all these other rain events that reduce the capacity of the existing storm system. So what we've looked at is if we update the model to current conditions. So when we update by 20%, it puts us in alignment with current rainfall amounts and helps with those successive rain events. As a perspective on this one, if we put the amounts into perspective, with a 10% increase, we'd be asking developers to detain the same amount that they have to do right now for the northern part of the city of Bellevue. With a 20% increase, we'd be asking developers to detain the same amount of water that they do now for like southern Bellevue, the city of Newcastle area. So what they're already doing now in other jurisdictions, we could apply here. For this reason, we're looking at increasing the 24-hour precipitation calculations by about 20%. So future considerations, other considerations that are going to reduce stormwater impacts require a more robust citywide discussion. And so we're going to bring them to you as recommendations for your consideration in the next comprehensive plan update. These considerations include implementations of impervious surface maximums for new and redevelopment. They currently can develop on commercial properties up to 100% impervious minus setbacks and landscaping. There might be something there that we can look at to reduce those maximums. A requirement for developers to bring the whole project site up instead of just the project area might also be something that we could consider. And then the other thing we're looking at is incentives to reduce impervious surfaces for existing residential properties. For example, the incentives there for commercial properties right now, because their stormwater fees are directly calculated from the amount of impervious surface they have and then divided by the amount of area that they have, while residents are charged a flat fee. So looking at incentives such as cost shares or maybe a change in our billing structure could provide these types of incentives and allow for retrofitting of existing residential systems. Other considerations that we'll bring forward is tree retention. I know we already have a tree retention, but maybe taking a look at that, seeing if there's an update there that we want to take a look at. Incentives for stream restoration projects or additional canopy cover. As we know, these are multi-benefit. Protection of forested areas. What we found is street trees are excellent, but we, in stormwater at least, we're looking at single trees and forested conditions in the same lens. And we really need to put more of a focus on these forested areas because they provide a better benefit. Also looking at requirements to select maybe native plant species for new and redevelopment projects. They're already acclimated to the current environment. They require less watering, they require less maintenance, and it tends to have greater habitat benefits in addition to our stormwater improvements. So next is additional requirements based on on-site temperature conditions are things that our other jurisdictions are looking at and things that we might want to consider in the future. For example, requirements such as light roofing materials, additional shading in areas where we find we've got heat island issues, and vegetation requirements help us to reduce those higher ambient temperatures in the summer times. And it also cools the temperature of that stormwater as they flow over them and then enter our streams. Oops. So for next steps, the update to our rain event amounts, we're going to be looking at those and making sure that we've considered all of the options before we make any changes to that. So that'll be coming in 2022 with a plan of updating in our 2023 Bothell standards. The other items were going to be brought for consideration to you in 2022 and 2023 with the idea of bringing any of these approved items for council as part of the next full comprehensive plan update. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Geer. I'll look to the commissioners. Any questions on the presentation? Carson, you're holding yourself back. Commissioner Curd.
I am holding myself back, but if no one else has something to say, I will. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is really exciting and interesting stuff for me, and it has a big impact on our environmental footprint as a city, and I'm keenly interested in that. A couple of questions and kind of comments that I have. I and some of the other members of the commission and also the community were involved with a couple of stormwater discussions, or one at least, a little bit earlier on in the year. And I'm wondering how that process went and if it's going to be kind of continued on a basin by basin basis, or if it's going to just be wrapped into comprehensive update instead.
So you're absolutely correct. So you're talking about the lower North Creek. And so when I was talking about that requirement to focus on one catchment area, that was the area that we selected for ecology that we're going to consider all of these updates. And so when we talk about these updates that we want to implement citywide, they're going to be implemented in that lower North Creek area, but we really want to put them into our regulations so that, for example, when a project comes in, they're not having to look at a map as to, what type of conditions they need to address. We're just going to go through and keep them consistent citywide. So that's the hope. We do have a plan to touch base on each one of those, what we call surface water management areas. And so we're hoping to tackle one per year. So you'll see one in early 2022, and then we'll just keep going. But again, it's, if it's, we have a lot of really similar conditions in the city. And I think when we went through that process, we were explaining to everybody too, that we have really similar water quality conditions. We've got really similar impervious surface conditions. And so as we went through and did this analysis, it's fairly similar conditions throughout. And so as we look at each one and focus on things we might be able to do, we're definitely looking at the citywide perspective.
That's really great. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, I just hadn't followed up on that process, and so it's good to get some closure there. I have a lot of questions, so I will try and pare them back and maybe send an email too. But one of the things that I work as a geologist, and so we do a lot of stormwater infiltration testing in lots of jurisdictions around Puget Sound. And that has a direct impact on, or the determination of a stormwater rate is dependent on soil type and groundwater depth and amount of impervious surfaces in the area, lots of different things. But Bothell is kind of a unique city in that it is built around sort of a river valley. North Creek runs kind of north-south through our city, and there are deposits of pretty clean sand that can house water as groundwater. And a lot of the areas in this North Creek Valley are paved over just due to our history as a suburban town. And so I'm wondering, because a lot of stormwater is generated off of those warehouses and parking lots in the river valley, which is a really great resource to cool water down as groundwater as it infiltrates through the soil from rain. I'm wondering if there's been any consideration to investigate the adoption of a critical aquifer recharge area, not for the purposes of drinking water, but for the purposes of protecting the quality and quantity of groundwater to restore and recharge North Creek during these lower summer flows that are projected in the future. I know City of Kenmore has investigated that pretty recently, but I'm wondering about Bothell.
So I can tell you that they went through an analysis before I came, and that's a really good point and definitely something that we can look at again into the future about those inputs. When we went through that analysis for the surface water management areas, I can tell you that what we're looking at right now is our new regulations. And so we went through a whole series of what is going to be redeveloped on its own or developed with these new regulations that require those lower amounts of impervious surface and increased infiltration rates. And so what we're focusing on is what are those areas that won't, either it's not attractive to newer redevelopment or some of those critical areas that we need to make sure that we're protecting. And so that's the next piece of these surface water management areas is what are those missing pieces that we can either get grant funding for? And like you're saying, you either complete a restoration project or something to remove those impervious surfaces, or what can we give as far as incentives for those existing conditions that people might find attractive? For example, like we were talking about with our billing, or perhaps like a cost share program to remove those because both businesses and residents are very receptive to those types of programs. I don't know, Jeff, if you can speak at all to the aquifer recharge. I know it happened like 2003 or 4. It was a long time ago that they really focused on a couple of those. And I'm not sure if we've got something on the planning side.
Yeah, offhand, I know the terminology and I remember hearing about it, but I don't recall specifics. Yeah, so.
Okay, that's definitely something we can put in there then for the future. It's a great consideration.
I see
I can weigh
Senior
in on
Planner
that.
Boyd raised his hand and then Commissioner Dodd.
You're right. In the 2004 comp plan update is when there were two critical aquifer recharge areas identified. One was on Norway Hill, and probably the more important one is in the Fitzgerald sub area. It's not just in the, but that's where the focus has been. And a lot of the updates that were done more recently than that in the Fitzgerald sub area were to address that. And out of that came our clustering provisions and other provisions for restoring forest habitat where appropriate and where possible. The Norway Hill one, I know it was used as a justification for keeping some of the R 40,000 zoning there, basically one unit per acre zoning, which was challenged, but was upheld. But more of the focus has been on Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Dave. Commissioner Dodd.
I had a much less technical question. So this just struck at me in your presentation. So you mentioned incentives for commercial and also residential and something about billing. And I was thinking, I don't know that I can't think of where I would have paid for storm. So is that when you say billing for residential, how do you collect those bills? Like where would I see that, or would I not see that as a property owner in Bothell?
Right. So the way we bill currently is under your property. I'm spacing on it, but it's your property taxes. So we bill through the counties, and so you would see that on your every 6 months or that 1 year is where it's billed. And so residents, you pay a flat fee, and it's not that much, but for commercial properties, they definitely know about their stormwater fees because it's based on their direct impervious services, and so it's a big incentive for them to reduce those fees.
I gotcha. Thank you. That I do pay those, so appreciate that.
Oh, good.
Commissioner Westerbeck.
Thanks.
And then Commissioner
Wester-
Gustafson.
Thanks, Commissioner Westerbeck. Probably a simple question. It looked like I've experienced using the stormwater manual a little bit. It looks like we're still following the King County stormwater manual. Is Bothell going to, is our problem more acute because of what Commissioner Kerr brought up? Are we doing anything above and beyond or any amendments to the King County manual that we're embellishing or enhancing our efforts in our own land use code about what stormwater requirements are required for projects?
So we're not above and beyond right now. They just updated the King County Surface Water Design Manual. And so we went to council letting them know that we will update that in our standards and ordinances as of Jan 1, 2022. So there wasn't huge updates in this round. But what we do is we provide additional detail or things that we wanted to make sure that happen in our standards. And so if you read the general notes in Chapter 4 of the Bothell standards, you'll be able to see we're just really specific on things we'll allow. And we don't allow proprietary systems without a deviation. And that's only so that people can provide us with that information that says, yes, this system's going to work. No, it's not going to, fail on the maintenance end and cause a bunch of homeowners to have to maintain something that's very expensive. So,
okay, that's helpful. Just curious. Thanks.
So Commissioner Gustafson, then Commissioner Alderks.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Supervisor Gear, for giving us this update. I appreciate that you mentioned that the city's taking a full area approach instead of an area by area approach. So my question is about one specific area. So let me know if it's out of scope, please. I believe that there is some contamination in Swamp Creek near the Shelton View Forest, some arsenic contamination at the frothing topsoil site. And I was wondering, how is the city considering this when it comes to restoration and cleanup efforts, and what is being planned by the city, or is it being taken care of by other entities?
right. That is not something that I'm aware of. I know that they've talked about something over there. Michael, do you happen to know anything about that? Or typically we maintain public property, and we have a couple contaminated sites downtown that Capitol's actively working with Department of Ecology to clean up. But I'm not aware of what they're doing on that site.
And I'm not aware of any contamination either in the Shelton View Forest, the DNR property, or anything like that, which is all uphill from the gravel operation. So I'm not sure that, and the gravel operation is actually outside the city limits. So we wouldn't have any regulatory authority over that. And any contamination flow as a result of groundwater, I would think would not be a concern in terms of something uphill. Now it is in our future annexation area. So from that standpoint, I think it's something that we have an interest in, but right now we have no, as far as I know, we have no active project or authority in that area.
I might add briefly that Michael mentioned that site is outside the city limits, and so we don't have any direct work on any development proposals there. But I am aware that in the last 6 months or so, Snohomish County has entertained at least a pre-application for a redevelopment of that site. Now they've been under a closure method for some time now. They've been it's not a restoration per se. That's a DOE thing and everything else. They've been ramping down the gravel mining operations there, and they've been sort of taking in clean dirt and things like that. But they had a pre-app on a redevelopment proposal there within the last 6 months or so. And of course, you never know if those will go forward, but should something go forward in a true redevelopment site, then you'd have all kinds of new systems created to deal with runoff. And I'm sure that the things you talk about are probably part of that consideration.
Great. Thank you for that information. That's really helpful.
Commissioner Aldrich.
Thank you, Chair. Jenny Aldrich here. I realized we kind of did a stack in this meeting tonight, whereas everybody just kind of got in line. So thank you for catching that. And Janet, thanks for this presentation. I really do appreciate it. Always a fan of the visuals as well. So thanks for including those. And my question for you is, at one point you mentioned that you look at each site perhaps as if it were forested. And so the impact, please, can you explain that to me a little better so I can understand it? Because very little of Bothell is still forested. And so what are the benefits of looking at it from that perspective?
So basically what it is you, in the past, you only had to detain to what was there. And so what we're making them do is detain the same amount of water that a forest would if it was on that site. And so it's basically a higher amount of water that they have to detain or infiltrate basically within that system. And so what we're doing with that is you basically can't, we're making them detain as though the forest exists, covering all of Bothell. And so it's a higher level of detention than anybody's had to do before, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
Other commissioner questions, comments? Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. One other thing that I wanted to ask about was related to Commissioner Aldrich's question when it said, when you mentioned that certain types of restoration get us more impact than others. Could you just explain what are the places that you would focus on and refresh my memory?
So the two types that we kind of talked about are, stream restoration. So we typically focus on stream buffers, riparian areas to improve stream health conditions and to capture some of that runoff. But then the other type of restoration that we were talking about is if you have a fully impervious site, we can provide incentives for people to remove that impervious surface and plant native plants, for example, or basically any infiltration that you allow on something that's totally impervious is an improved condition, but it's different from our stream and restoration enhancement.
Mr. Chair, you're muted.
Didn't mute, sorry. Senior Planner Lamb, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I yield to the other commissioners, so you can circle around back to me. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Commissioner Westerbeck, did I see your hand?
Yeah, hopefully this will be brief again. This is from my built environment sort of brain. If I recall, maybe in talking with Senior Planner Boyd, when doing a building that has a lot of say a zero lot line building where we're covering almost the entire site, like in downtown area with building, are we allowed to, or is it effective to use a green roof so that it absorbs stormwater, slows it as it flows into the city's system? Is that an effective and usable methodology? It seems like it's been done in the past, but I don't recall, and I've not had the chance to do it.
So I'll answer a little bit, and then I'm sure Dave Boyd's probably got something to say about this piece as well. From a stormwater aspect, absolutely yes. Those are definitely an effective means. But I will say that the reason they haven't been implemented a lot when they come in for review is because they're typically more expensive than other techniques. And if it's a roof, they don't consider those pollution generating sources, and so they don't have a lot of benefit from implementing something like that. We would love to see them, but my assumption is they don't come in because of the cost.
Yeah, they have a very high price tag. You're right. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Alderks.
Thank you, Chair. Kind of along the same lines as Carrie's question, but down on the ground. I didn't necessarily hear mention of, but I saw several examples in your presentation of rain gardens and their effectiveness. Could you just speak briefly on the rain garden program and how members of the community can have positive environmental impact through those, and just give us some information on sort of relate that to your presentation this evening? I would really appreciate it.
Certainly. So for new and redevelopment, they call them bioretention cells, but they're rain gardens. That's what they are. They just happen to be connected to our storm system, so they get a fancy name. And they are very effective at allowing for infiltration and water quality treatment. There is some question of over time whether we need to replace the mulch and soils, to provide that additional water quality benefit, but they definitely are effective and well used. Again, it's something that costs developers a little less, and so you're going to see a lot of rain gardens going in on new and redevelopment. For existing, and when you were talking about communities getting involved, we have a program that we're running through the conservation districts where we build community rain gardens. And so if that's something that people are interested in, we're always looking for communities where people would like to have something installed. I think we've installed 4 or 5 so far. And then we've also installed a couple at Frank Love Elementary and a couple of other places with students. So definitely, if that's something you're interested in, please let us know. And then that's what I'm talking about with incentives in the future, is how can we incentivize people to install them of their own accord.
Commissioner Curd.
I'll keep this brief, I promise. Kind of piggybacking off of Commissioner Alderk's question about incentivizing volunteer sort of programs. City of Seattle it has a different context than Bothell for sure, but it has its own stormwater management manual too. And in their most recent update in July, they sort of liberalized the way that small bioretention cells are designed. As long as they include an overflow, it's an improvement over direct discharge into the city's either combined sewer or, like in Bothell's case, a storm system. And so I'm wondering if you see any ways for that process to kind of get trimmed down a little bit so that it's not so laborious for people to apply for. I know that there's training and there's some resources out there, but it's still kind of, for a homeowner, there's a lot of seemingly red tape and permitting costs, so on. So do you see any ways for improvement there?
I definitely see ways for improvement, and you're absolutely right. One of the things that that kind of stops homeowners from either removing their driveway or installing these types of systems is because of the infiltration rates that they have got to meet. And so it does require them to do a certain level of analysis, which does cost money and time. It's a little bit more intensive than a standard, putting in a driveway, for example, that kind of thing. And so you're absolutely right. We can't let somebody install something and have them flood themselves and their neighbors. And so there's that dance. But again, maybe it's something that we can provide through the conservation districts or another entity that works on land use on the private side, where they can complete that analysis for them, or they can complete the design for them. And you're absolutely right. Seattle and King County are able to do it because they've got those combined sewer overflows. And so CSOs get a lot more leeway in how they can use their money. We have to provide a direct water quality benefit in order for the city to fund those, and haven't been super successful because what's happened, for example, when the Queensboro neighborhood, we went in with the full intention of implementing a whole bunch of LID with the homeowners, and they were really excited about it. And we got right to the end, and then they realized we needed a covenant for all of them, because if we install something, it's got to stay there forever. And so every single one of them backed out. They said, thanks so much, but I don't want a covenant on my property. And so with best of intentions, nothing got installed. So definitely continue to look at that, and it's something we want to move forward with, but we haven't been as successful yet. So definitely a place to improve.
Thank you. Other commissioners? Senior Planner Lamb, did you wish to make a comment?
Yeah, thank you, and good to see you all this evening. Look, I just wanted to say thanks so much to Janet and her team. I want to appreciate you and your staff for coming in, helping educate us and get us up to speed on the new standards, and helping us with other efforts in Canyon Park with the bonus incentive program and all of that. And I enjoyed your presentation, and in particular, the last few slides with recommendations for scoping for the comprehensive plan, since that's going to be a major effort that we're starting next year. So yeah, just appreciate the collaborative relationship and the proactive approach that you all are taking, especially in light of some of the House bills that didn't pass the last session, but might come back around the next time, in particular 1099, where we get a added climate and resiliency element. And so I think your updates to your manual is going to be a good foundation for how to address those issues. So thanks a lot.
Definitely. And thank you so much. These are great. And, ideas that you've already put out, I'll definitely include those for consideration that we can bring back to you at a future date.
All right. Any final comments? Commissioner Curd.
Thank you. First, thank you again so much for this presentation. And one last final note is that you did mention tree canopy considerations. And that's something that I think is just a very minor part of the presentation, but it's got a big place in the commission's heart and mind. And I think one of the things that we need to think about when we consider tree canopy is the disparate impacts that lack of tree canopy has had on different parts of our city, and looking at tree canopy improvements through an equity lens. And so I just encourage that maybe our DEI department sort of take a look at these things as we're moving through into the comprehensive plan to make sure that this is sort of something that we are getting out in front of instead of catching up behind like we kind of were with Canyon Park. So again, thank you.
All right. Yes, there's been a lot of work recently about heat islands and how they are located disproportionately in certain communities. So certainly something to be aware of as we move forward. So thank you very much for your presentation. I think, as you can see, there's a lot of interest on the commission. We hesitated not including the requirement in the Canyon Park plan only because of the interest in moving forward quickly on some of the other items and the assurance of the very good work you're doing already. So we could count on some of these issues being handled without delaying the other interests. But we do look forward to continuing to hear from you on this. And thank you again.
Certainly. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
All right.
Thank you, Janet.
Yes. So with that, we'll move on to our next agenda item, a public hearing on Bothell Municipal Code 12.32.120 regarding site plan submittal. And Director Cotterman, we'll open the hearing.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll turn it over to the man who needs no introduction because he's been with the city for over 30 years now. And that's our Development Services Manager, Mr. Jeff Smith. So Jeff's going to talk a little bit about the background of why we're doing this particular amendment. There's a series of amendments. Some of it is the meat of the site plan ordinance that we put in place a couple of years ago. And most of the rest of it are some cleanup items to help fix some ambiguities that are in the code. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Director Cotterman and Chair Kiernan. Thank you very much, and members of the Planning Commission. It's really a pleasure to be here with you guys as well. This may not be quite as scintillating as stormwater management, but it's pretty good stuff anyway. These amendments came about 3 years ago or so, going on 4 years now. We implemented a site plan review process, which was intended to create a vestable land use entitlement action for the types of projects that didn't need them otherwise. For example, subdivisions and conditional use permits and some of the other things that we do, those were already built in as vestable. Now, vestable means is when you apply for a permit, you are entitled to operate under a set of regulations that exist at the time you submit your application. And then you can move forward with that, and there's a timeline on things like that. So people would have some reliability to the regulations that they were designing under and things like that when they submitted their applications. But there were a whole lot of things that didn't have those activities just yet. And we were doing, for example, site planning. When you have a development site and you start to lay out all the various components of development sites, you didn't actually vest to those regulations until you submitted for building permits, primarily building permits. And that can be a little ways down the line in terms of planning and designing and developing particularly complex sites. And so the city adopted a site plan review process, a mechanism by which we could get a lot of those elements on the table, understood. People could rely upon something that they got approved before they invested very heavily in building permits and primarily engineering and infrastructure permits. So they had some reliability to the things that they were allowed to design toward. It became clear to us that there may be a small problem with that with respect to vesting laws in the state of Washington. And primarily that was that due to case law and some other factors, communities could not create what were considered barriers or roadblocks to vestability, to someone's ability to vest themselves. And so if a building permit is one of the only and principal ways of vesting to applicable regulations, the city couldn't necessarily say, but you have to do all these other things first before you can apply for that permit and therefore get vested. There was lots of good reasons for having the site plan review in place, and we're going to continue to have that in place. But it potentially raised an issue with creating this barrier to vesting, which flies in the face of some case law. So we went back and took a look at it. I think it's important to note that site plan vesting and the things that we were trying to do in terms of sequencing these permit applications really were helpful both to applicants in our development community and to staff in the city of Bothell, because it allowed us to better sequence some of these permit applications so that we would understand things before they invested a lot of money. And again, as I said, very detailed building plans or very detailed engineering plans for their site developments. And so we had a clause in the site plan section of the code, which is 1232. And that said, you need to get your site plan done first before you apply for some of these other permits. And again, it was feared, I guess, that may rise to the level of a barrier to vesting, and that we could have some legal issues if we maintain that. So working with our legal department, we've crafted an amendment, a series of amendments that will remove that quite technically. So applicants would, if they insisted, would be allowed to apply for their building permits at the same time as their site plan permits. Importantly, we still don't issue those permits until the site plan is approved, but you could submit it for review. And once you submit it and you're deemed complete, you are a vested project. So that's the important part. So these amendments effectively remove that prohibition against having to get your site plan done first before you can submit your application for building permit. Now, again, I said there were a lot of benefits to doing it the way we had it set up before, the sequencing that we had set up before. And in fact, there's a benefit in terms of cost and complexity to applicants, and there's clearly a benefit to city staff because it tends to sequence these out so that we understand what the site's going to look like and all its elements, and then we understand its infrastructure, then we understand its building, and it just makes a lot more sense. So what we've included language in the code now in this amendment that still strongly encourages applicants to sequence their projects, but we will take their building permit applications in for review simultaneous with their site plan applications, but we won't issue them until we're finished with the site plan. Practically speaking, what that might mean is that an applicant could be processing a building permit application through our system and a site plan at the same time. And if the site plan outcome materially affects and alters what the building can look like, what shape it is, what size it is, what height it is, all that kind of stuff, that applicant is going to have to modify those building plans to meet the site plan conditions that precede it. That's an expensive outcome, and that's an expensive thing. And we would hope that would create an internal incentive, if you will, to the process that would have people sequence those things better, sequence them as we had them set up before. We're always going to have circumstances where, for example, sometimes applicants will want to vest to a building permit because there's a code change coming or something like that, and they want to get ahead of that a little bit. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, and I won't go into all the details on that. So it is possible for them to do it. They just understand that they're going to be taking the risk that they're going to have to redo a fair amount of their plans in order to comply with their site plan. Secondary to that, in this series that the legal department, Robbie Sepler and others have put together, is that we try to go through and make consistent other sections of the code that relate to this, and that has to do with our vesting language. And so the principal action is under 1232-120, And the subordinate actions are under titles 18, I believe. I'm going to do a quick scan. 17, 18, title 20, things like that. That again, make sure that our code is internally consistent with this idea that you can submit your building permit in advance of your site plan approval, but you won't get it issued until that site plan approval is finished. So I think that pretty well encapsulates the action that we're asking you. We're recommending that you advance to the city council with a recommendation for approval. I will point out too, by the way, so we had suspended that section of code last year, and that suspension expires December 9th. And so these series of amendments are designed to track toward a council approval such that that suspension can go away and these amendments fix what we had suspended the code for in the first place. So I hope that helps.
All right, commissioners, questions? Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Manager Smith, for answering this question, as well as my previous question about Shelton View. I am trying to understand the scope of this change, and I got caught up on trying to think of what are examples of projects that would not require building permits, because it seems like this is what these new laws would apply to.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Gustafson. There weren't exactly projects that would not require building permits, but in order to establish the site plan, that is stormwater management systems and all those other things like that, you don't necessarily have to propose a building yet, right? You can propose a part stormwater systems or all that other stuff that goes on to site plan elements, entry points, traffic circulation, environmental assessment, impact and mitigation. All of those factors, before we had this in place, could get done or could be proposed. They could be discussed with staff. They could be going through a permit application review, but they would not actually vest them to something. And that tends to make building community kind of nervous because they're operating with a fluid deck at that point, and that's generally an issue for them. So I hope that helps.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Westerbeck.
Thank you. Appreciate this, Jeff. As someone who designs site plans and buildings, I actually think this is the best of both worlds. I was happy about the change a few years back that we could submit a site plan early to get certainty and kind of entitle that site plan. That's a great thing when you're designing. But also the last 20 years, been on a few projects, particularly big ones that took months and sometimes years even to get done, where we were racing to stay within a certain building code. You know this routine. And the expense of the risk of having a site plan that has to be tweaked or a building has to be tweaked is less than having to redesign the project for the new code. So to me, this is, again, you get the best of both worlds, because there's I'm always going to want to submit a site plan first if I can for most projects, especially larger ones. But there are times when you really want to get that thing vested so that you have a larger amount of work that you can skip over if you get something wrong. Sometimes the site plan can be tweaked pretty easily. So anyway, I'm just happy to see this. So that was more of a comment than a question, but to me, it's just gives us one more option. So I know it wasn't necessarily welcome, but it worked out to me.
Very good. Thank you. Yep.
Sure.
Other commissioners? So I've got a question. This seems to be primarily around the matter of vesting. So you get the application in and you vest under the current regulations. Is there a potential circumstance where an application is submitted and there are so many changes required that the vesting would be lost?
Well,
It's
That
so
would-
inadequate for
Right. That would be essentially, that would be a choice of the applicant to decide, there's so much going on here. I can withdraw my building permit application and resubmit it. And Commissioner Westerbeck probably characterize this maybe better than I can, but there can be, there can be a lot of changes and that's why we still strongly encourage, is the word that we left in the code, because, and most builders, designers, architects, developers, and others, they understand that, as Commissioner Westerbeck just talked about. They definitely understand the pros and cons of this sort of thing. There is a possibility that they're not required to divest, if you will, or revest their project, but they are going to have to take on a lot of changes, and that at some point, I suppose there's a tipping point, where it's just like, we got to kind of do this over again. But that's their call, and so we're kind of comfortable letting them make that call because that's the thing that's a risk they need to take, and that's a risk they have to accept if they choose to do it that way. And I think it's important to point out too, site planning and the entire development review process that we go through, for some people for some projects, that's a relatively rapid succession of things. For others, they really do need to take some time on the front end and really work through a lot of issues before they're ready to promote a building. Other projects, for example, they might go through a site planning process like that. Maybe, I don't know, I never know this stuff, but maybe just to get a site ready to resell to someone else who will actually put a building on a site. And we don't even know who the builder at that point is, and the builder buys what they see and what they get. And there's a lot of scenarios where it can work out.
So to restate, I guess, if the applicant meets the baseline requirements for submitting that building permit, that project is vested regardless of additional changes, unless they choose to withdraw and resubmit.
They would be vested to that building code in effect at the time of
the yes.
application. Yes.
Understood. All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Other commissioner comments, questions? Seeing none, Director Cotterman, should we open the public hearing?
I believe the public hearing is open
Okay.
at the beginning before the presentation, Mr.
All
Chair.
right.
And I just wanted to let you know, we do have one person in the attendee room. It's Mike Stanger, so I'm presuming he's here for the reduced parking discussion. But Mike, if you did want to testify on this public hearing item, please raise your hand. Not seeing a hand raised, Mr. Chair, so I don't believe we have anyone to speak on this tonight.
All right. So seeing as there is no testimony on this matter before us, we would close the public hearing. So you're looking for action from the commission supporting moving forward?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So is there a motion? Commissioner Dodd?
I move to approve the code amendments as presented.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Commissioner Westerbeck. Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Any discussion around that motion?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
could I ask for a clarification from Commissioner Dodd regarding the motion? Is the motion to recommend approval of the proposed amendments by the council?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. Thank you. I just wanted to be clear about that.
So there is a motion before the commission made and seconded to move these amendments to Bothell Municipal Code 12.32.120 to the council with the support of the commission. All in favor of that motion, please indicate. I see Commissioner Dodd, Commissioner Westerbeck, Commissioner Curd, Commissioner Alderks, Commissioner Gustafson, and myself. So you have unanimous approval to move this forward.
Thank you. Appreciate your time tonight. It's been very nice. I really have enjoyed meeting you all and seeing you all tonight. Thank you.
And thank you for your presentation. We appreciate your time as well. So
Thank you.
And I have to concur with what you said at the beginning, Jeff. This is definitely not as interesting as the
Ooh.
I know. Hey, I know where my bread is buttered, right? Thank you.
A little burn on the way out there.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care.
All right. So with that, we'll close the public hearing. Our next item is a study session on the parking reduction code amendments. I have a suspicion this one will generate a fair amount of discussion and interest. Is there an interest in a brief break before we launch into that? Because I don't see another break afterwards. I see some nodding heads. So let's take a 10-minute break. If there are no issues with that, I see 7:06 on time on my computer. So we'll come back at 7:16 and reconvene for a study session on the expanded parking reductions code amendment. See you all in a few. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are resuming the November 17th meeting of the Bothell Planning Commission tonight here at 7:17. The next item on our agenda is a study session around the expanded parking reductions code amendment. Director Cotterman, would you like to introduce this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Someone else who needs no introduction, certainly to this group. So Senior Planner Dave Boyd, who's been working with Mike Stanger from Arch, who's also joining us this evening. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. And the purpose of this is a study session with the commission regarding an item that it was actually before you last year. And I know Dave's going to go into that a little bit more, but just as a reminder, this is a proposed reduction in parking that the commission considered. The council adopted the commission's recommendation, but held back one item at staff's request to see if we might be able to get some more affordable housing out of that reduction allowance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave to go through the materials.
Thank you and good evening all. I would also like to acknowledge Mike and thank him for Mike Stanger for joining us tonight. Mike hasn't had a chance yet to get into analysis of what affordability requirements we might be able to pair with these code amendments. But the idea of tonight's meeting was really a high-level introduction and to get some feedback on some basic direction before we go into the detailed analysis on potential affordability requirements. So with that, I will share my screen. I have a brief PowerPoint. There we go. So this is, we have named this Expanded Parking Reductions Code Amendments, which may seem a little oxymoronic, but I'll remind everybody this grew out of the state's maximum minimum parking requirements near transit. So we're staying consistent with the theme there. And I will apologize. This isn't like the missing middle code amendments. We don't have a lot of fun images, so there'll be a lot of repetition, but at least you got some good fun images with the green stormwater infrastructure presentation tonight. So we're introducing these code amendments to expand provisions for reduced parking requirements. It started with the provisions for market rate housing, extending those provisions to half mile from the quarter mile that was mandated by the state from frequent transit. And we could satisfy ourselves with that, but while we're getting into this, a number of other issues have come up that I wanted to give the Planning Commission a chance to weigh in on and see if we wanted to wrap into these code amendments. So we could consider additional reductions as justified by a parking study. Many jurisdictions do allow reductions in parking through a parking study. Bothell never has, at least until when we adopted the state mandated minimums. We did allow some additional reductions through a parking study for certain types of projects. And then eventually we will be considering affordable housing provisions. This is an opportunity to apply affordable housing provisions, at least in some instances. And then we would, I know several of the commissioners are well-versed in parking policy, so we certainly are open to consider other options that we could wrap into these potential code amendments. So the background, the municipal code has had provisions for transit-related parking reductions dating back to the 90s. In 2020, we adopted state-mandated reductions, and Planning Commission did recommend extending the market rate reductions from a quarter mile to a half mile, but council chose at staff's suggestion to keep it at the state-mandated quarter mile, and to give us a chance to look at potential affordable housing provisions that go for areas that go beyond the state mandate. And the map here, and you'll see this repeated on throughout the slideshow pretty much, shows the existing frequent bus stops, at least those. The other thing about the state code, the state mandates, for each of the three different types of housing that they required maximum minimums. Affordable housing for very low and extremely low income households, senior and disabled housing, and for market rate housing. They all have different definitions for what constitutes frequent transit. So they may vary a little bit depending on which of those provisions you're applying. But basically, these are the stops that meet the frequency of 2 to 4 stops per hour for 12 hours, a minimum of 12 hours per day. And it basically amounts to the transit lines, the multiple bus lines that currently serve downtown, and the Swift bus rapid transit line that now extends as far as Canyon Park. These are subject to change, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So, actually, get into it right now. One question is, should the code consider proposed future transit? The Sound Transit Green Line, their bus rapid transit line, I'm sorry, the Sound Transit 522 bus rapid transit could result in consolidating some of the downtown's bus stops. So actually looking to the future, the areas where this would apply might shrink slightly. We don't really have yet all of the other agencies' bus service that will be feeding the Sound Transit line in place. We know we have a good idea of where the Sound Transit stops will be, but some of these others might actually no longer meet the frequent transit provisions. On the other hand, up the Green Line, the Swift Green Line in Canyon Park, certainly could add frequent stops along Bothell Everett Highway and Bothell Way when those improvements are made and they can extend the Green Line to downtown and to the campus. So I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit so we can see each other and have a little bit of a discussion about whether this should be a forward-looking, whether we should allow an applicant is really what it comes to, because the way these are structured so far, the applicant makes applies for the exemption and applies for the parking reduction. So should we allow an applicant to say, for example, in the year 2024, that community transit is now committed to extending the Green Line and have a stop at 240th and Bothell Everett Highway. Should a development within a half mile of that future frequent transit stop be able to reduce their parking for the future transit situation?
So, Commissioner, comments, questions on that specific issue? Commissioner Westerbeck.
I guess I had to comment. This is Dave. This is specifically the question number 1 about future or current transit, but I think we're wise to go with future. It's going to come up quickly on us, and planning for what we have now, even as you alluded to in the packet, it's going to be old news quickly. And there's just an acute need for transit. I think we're going to see more need and more interest in it rapidly. So I think planning ahead and assuming we're going to see a movement towards more transit, more micro mobility of all sorts as well. So I'm very much bullish on the forward-looking future transit planning and not the current transit planning.
Other commissioners, Commissioner Alderks.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this presentation. Really, I appreciate you said it was going to be brief, and you're right, it was. And so my question is, well, my thoughts are definitely forward thinking, because I do have a question about the future stops that are planned along 527. If I'm estimating what a half mile would look like, we very easily could have these we could easily connect downtown to Canyon Park with this zone, just with a few future already sort of known planned stops that are going to be added. Is that correct?
We're not at that point just yet. Community Transit has said that they haven't really committed to extending the Green Line once the capacity is there. But they've basically said that when that is in place, they will consider, and I think their long range plan is to extend it to downtown. They have not gone into any detailed planning about, at least that they've shared with us, about where those stops would be and how many stops there would be between Canyon Park and downtown. The obvious one obvious stop would be at 240th, or near 240th. So basically, we haven't really started devising any code language, but the question really is, should we devise that code language in a way, or should we establish criteria in such a way that an applicant, when there is a commitment for frequent transit to get the reductions based on future transit. I guess a better example of that is in downtown, where Sound Transit, now we have what I think are fairly firm dates about when those transit open lines are going to open. But that also, a year ago it was going to be 2025 or 24. Now it's been pushed back a year, and who knows, it could get pushed back a year again. But I think we're certainly on a course where we can, with some certainty, know that is going to be in place soon. And I just want to forewarn you, I stopped for discussion, but the presentation still goes on for a few more slides.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it.
Commissioner Dodd.
Thank you. And thanks, Dave, for the presentation thus far. So I agree with Commissioner Westerbeck. I think considering future transit plans is important, especially because it just gives us more of a long-term range as people are building projects and stuff. And I think that makes the most sense. Like, I don't know, I just think of like my house that I grew up in Bothell. There was no bus stop there when it was built in the 60s, but when we lived there in the 90s, like we used the bus to get all over the place. And that was back when we had a route that took me from where I lived in Queensboro down to downtown Bothell. So I think that is the best way to plan for the future, and hopefully to get people to take less, single driver trips as we get into the future. So that's my instinct. Thank you.
Other commissioner comments? Commissioner Westerbeck.
I'm sorry, I was going to wait for everyone else to go, but I did forget to finish my thoughts. I just wanted to mention each day, my 11-year-old daughter in middle school walks about 3/4 of a mile home from the bus. It's a little longer for her than some kids. And I meet her a couple days a week, and it's actually pretty efficient. It's about a 15-minute walk, even in the rain. It's not bad. So I've experienced that slightly, more than, well, 3/4 versus a half-mile walk. So a half mile is not very far to catch a bus. And I've actually ridden transit a lot throughout my adult years, and well, kids years too. We catch the bus as a high schooler, and we would routinely walk a half mile or more, heck, even a mile sometimes, to catch the bus once or twice a day. So I think partly just people who are interested in transit, especially people who are able-bodied, but also as long as we've got good public infrastructure for people who are in wheelchairs and so forth. It's not that far and can be done pretty quickly. So I think just the practical aspects, a half mile is not bad. Thanks.
Director Cotterman, did you want to weigh in?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to provide a little bit of more background and updated information, and apologies to Dave, we didn't have a chance to talk about this. Sound Transit's latest date for the opening of the 522 line is in 2026. That's officially the date. Unofficially, it may end up being closer to 2027. So just something to keep in mind. And at this point, we're not, I think officially they're saying 2027 for the I-405 BRT. And as Dave mentioned, we don't know yet about community transit because it's really dependent upon when the roadway improvements are made to Bothell Way, up connecting to the Bothell Everett Highway. The other thing I would mention, and again, apologies to Dave, we didn't have a chance to talk about this, but one of the things that occurs to me as I'm listening to the discussion is whether or not the commission would like to make a distinction between high capacity transit, which would include the bus rapid transit lines, versus more frequent transit, which is as part of the regular transit system. Regular transit schedules can change more often. High capacity transit is considered more stable, which is why some of the PSRC language, for example, in designating high capacity transit communities, is looking at BRT as part of high capacity transit in addition to light rail, commuter rail, ferries, and those kinds of things. So there is a distinction there. Whether the commission wants to factor that into your discussion is entirely up to you, but I just wanted to provide that information.
Commissioner Dodd.
Thank you. So oh goodness, sorry, puppy alert. So I did want to speak to something that Commissioner Westerbeck said. I think there are two things that I would hope all of our commissioners keep in mind as we debate this. So one, obviously reducing the amount of required parking doesn't mean that every developer, every project is going to have less parking. We're just making it possible to build less parking. They're still going to make sure that it's a good idea for that project because ultimately they want people to want to live there, right? But I would caution us too much, to not rely too much on I can walk 3/4 of a mile. It's not a big deal. My brother, who does not drive, who is an adult, who relies on transit to get to work and everything, will walk 2 miles to get to a bus if it's faster than waiting at the bus stop close to our house. My dad, who is a wheelchair user, could not get himself 1/4 of a mile to a bus stop. It's just not within his current capabilities. So we want to remember that there are no sidewalks that I can think of that are possible on Earth that would get my dad to a bus stop. So just let's make sure that we're keeping that in mind. So while I want to temper, using our personal experiences to say, oh, that's not that far, I also want to say it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a parking spot there for someone like my dad who just could not get himself to the bus stop. So, and yes, I'm using personal experiences to say don't use your personal experiences, but I just want to make sure we're thinking about all different kinds of situations. Thank you.
Commissioner Westerbeck.
I did not mean to raise my hand. I was scratching my face. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, you're on your screen. Your hand is up. Carry over.
I'm sorry. That was actually a mistake. I don't know how I clicked that. I apologize.
Not a problem. Commissioner Curd.
Thank you. And thanks, Dave, for your presentation so far. I think one of the things that I'm that's going through my head in thinking about future versus current is how long do we expect a new residential development to serve its purpose? And as an engineer adjacent field, we plan structures to last for 75 years before we don't provide warranty for them anymore. And so if we imagine a new residential structure to be developed on 240th and Bothell Everett Highway with lots of parking as our current code mandates, for 75 years, that amount of parking is going to be inducing people to live there that are dependent on that parking. Whereas if we think, maybe 2028 or 2030, we might have the improvements in the 6-year TIP and everything to improve and get Green Line, Swift Green Line down to downtown Bothell. Maybe 2032, maybe 2040, but that's still within the 75-year lifespan, and we're still to me, this question is more about how long do you think a residential development has a lifespan? And so for me, I tend to think more that we don't want to just tear down new development, and we don't necessarily want to plan for parking that's not needed. And so in the future, and so I think that, we should look to more of a future scope, just because we build something once with the intent for it to last a long time.
All right, thank you. Other commissioner comments? So I've got two thoughts. First of all, it seems like we're almost talking about a chicken and egg circumstance. Like, do we wait to get the requirement to lessen the requirement for parking until the transit is there, or do we reduce the requirement in hopes of inducing the transit? And if there's demand, it could drive transit planning as much as anything. So I'm somewhat inclined to reduce it and look to the future, and perhaps through demand make the future come sooner. So that's one thought there. And my second thought is regarding walkability, and perhaps expanding on Commissioner Dodd's comment. I think if we do move in this direction, we need to look at how we look at walkability. And I'll focus on one street in particular on that map, 15th. And I've walked 15th from 228th up to Stipek a number of times. And the sidewalks there are checkerboard on one side of the street and then another. So if we do look at these zones of reduced parking, I think we also need to look to prioritize connectivity of those sidewalks. And if you walk that particular street, there are points where there is sidewalk on one side of the street, sidewalk on the other side of the street, and we could at least have a crosswalk connecting them. So I think we need to be a little more expansive in looking at making things walkable. So that's my thoughts on that. Anything else on this particular item? Dave, have you gotten some feedback on this to help you? Oh, Commissioner Alderks.
Thanks, Chair. I would also add that because of those river valleys that exist here in Bothell, some of those sidewalks are on very steep hills, and that does impact walkability and inclusivity. And so I'm glad that we're having these conversations and recognizing that we do not live in a flat place that makes everywhere easy to get around. So just want to throw that out there and include that in the conversation.
Great feedback. And yes, that does give me the direction. So the direction I'm taking is that we do need to look at some criteria or some mechanism that would allow an applicant to apply for the exemption based on planned future transit, at least. On the walkability and the issues, I would remind the commission, I think you were all involved in this. There was a discussion last time around whether we should apply a walk shed, a half-mile walk shed, as opposed to just a half-mile buffer. And the consensus was, and the decision was to go with a half-mile buffer, partly because it's easier and partly because it takes in more properties. And so it may actually include some properties that would be closer to a 3/4 mile walk. And I guess the other thing I would note is that there's nothing magical about a 1/4 mile or a half mile. Those are the distances that were included in the state legislation. There's nothing that keeps us from going beyond those or below their maximum minimum. So just keep that in mind. And with that,
we're pausing for a moment, and my comment was not intended to be inconsistent with that, but rather to suggest that as the city looks at capital plans and sidewalk constructions, and I think we did a real good job with the schools. And I looked at 15th rather than 19th because the 19th has been developed very well to be walkable from 228th upward because of the school path. If we're looking at higher density residential areas, I think we should also consider those for prioritizing walking corridors. And again, my example was something even as simple as a crosswalk connecting those two, painted crosswalk connecting those two segments across the street would help.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't mean to be contrary to what you're saying. And I think that is something that, part of your recommendation could be to address that in the upcoming comp plan, make sure that we prioritize those areas within walking distance of transit for pedestrian infrastructure.
So before we move on, I see Commissioner Dodd with her hand up, and then Director Cotterman.
Sorry, as Commissioner Curd is to wastewater and stormwater, I am to sidewalks. So I wanted to echo what you said, Chair Kiernan. I also live in the Snohomish County part of Bothell and experienced some very patchy sidewalk networks. Right near me on 228th, there's a stretch of shoulder that just is shoulder, and then there's extruded curb, and then there's like sidewalk, extruded curb, sidewalk again. And that's what my aforementioned brother walks every day. And I play this really unpleasant game because I also bike there with my child, where when I'm driving, I look at how many cars weave into the shoulder because there's nothing blocking them on the shoulder part. But I still, with safety in mind, my family still uses that infrastructure, and I wouldn't want to wait to develop more walkable, less parking developments for that to be fixed. But I also at the same time, I'm like, hello, please fix this. So I fully understand that we're not perfect, but I wouldn't want to wait on that because it definitely becomes just a long waiting game. So although the extruded curb showed up out of nowhere a few years ago, and I'm very happy with it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Director Cotterman, did you want to weigh in?
Just some additional information, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I just wanted to add to something that Dave said about the state legislation. That is where the 1/4 mile and the half mile that we're talking about come from, but there is a basis for that I think it's important the commission knows about as well. And that came out of research that I did while I worked for the city of Bellevue on the light rail project. What most studies have found is that people will walk up to a 1/4 mile to a bus stop. This is the typical person, and obviously that's also dependent upon the availability of sidewalks, the walkability, the sense of safety and security. There are a lot of factors that go into that, but generally speaking, a 1/4 mile is about how far people will walk to a typical bus stop. The half mile is what most people will walk distance they'll walk to a light rail stop. And usually BRT is combined with light rail. It's because it's also considered high capacity transit. And again, that has to do with the frequency and the dependability of the frequency of that transit service. So I just wanted to give the commission that additional background. That's the basis for the 1/4 mile and the half mile.
Thank you, Director Cotterman. Senior Planner Boyd, do you wish to continue?
Yeah, I will share my screen again. Oh, oh wait a second. Are you seeing the full screen there?
No, well, you've got your panel on the side.
Yeah, okay. Okay, here we go.
Yes.
Oh, next slide. Again, that's the rough location of where I would expect at least one Swift Line green stop to be located. Oh, another second question, and these aren't exactly in the same order as in the memo. I've combined some together that seem to make sense. So then another question is, should a parking study be required for further reductions beyond what's already been included in the code? And the code that we've adopted does allow by right a reduction in certain circumstances to the one parking space per bedroom. And then with a parking study, they can go down to the 0.75 per unit because the state legislations allowed either of those levels of parking. So one thing is to in the current code I think there's a need to clarify that to go below the parking study is only needed in the situations where we allow it to go below one space per bedroom. And then another question, so in the amendments that we passed to date, well, for senior and disabled housing, we allow it to go down as low as 0.3 spaces per unit. But for affordable housing, it's as low as 0.75 spaces per unit. Should we consider flexible parking requirements and allow it to go below that if it can be justified by a parking study? And then when we get into that, and this is probably something we should have considered with the previous amendments, is will there be a need for third-party review of a parking study, similar to what we do now for critical area studies? Because staff doesn't have the expertise in critical areas. We do require applicants to pay for a third-party review of critical areas reports. Do we need to include a similar provision in the code for reductions, parking reductions justified by a parking study? So again, I'm going to stop sharing. We can tackle those questions.
So, Commissioner, comments or questions on those matters? Commissioner Westerbeck.
I was going to wait for someone else to start this time, but clearly I'm going to go first again. Well, I've got some sort of, I don't know if we call them conflicting thoughts, but just some thoughts about this. I'm always a little concerned about parking studies because they add a fair amount of cost to small, medium-sized projects. And the more costs added on fees to projects that aren't large, the less viable they become. And frequently, we see, like I've even been involved organizations that wanted to do not the block size buildings we're often seeing in downtown Bothell. They want to do smaller, 5, 10, 20, up to 50 units or something. And every time there's an added cost, especially if they're trying to do affordable housing, it just makes it that much harder to realize a project. there is a study from, I think, it's the Victoria Transportation Institute. I've got that's from June of 21, showing it's required minimum parking is one of the biggest hurdles to getting affordable housing built. And frequently the demand when it's been studied, and I think Arch and there was another presentation a few years ago from a Snohomish County affordable housing entity that said something similar, that it's one of the biggest obstacles to getting these projects realized. The parking is so expensive, it takes a lot of land, and frequently people who are on the who need affordable housing and low-income housing often can't afford to own cars anyway, so the demand is lower. So just some thoughts on that. The parking study can be a real hurdle. It's not a big deal for a huge developer. At the same time, if we said if you do a parking study, you can reduce your parking, or you can be more flexible with it, and maybe decrease it considerably below the 0.75 we allow for affordable and we call it low income and very low income housing in our code. I think that's a real important tool that we could consider. In that case, the parking study could be a real important piece, and it could be worth paying that $10,000 or so dollars. It might be. So, like I said, I'm kind of of two minds on that, because I see both the use for it and see it as an obstacle. At the same time, it's been shown over and over and over, at least in the development community that I work with, that parking drives, as the packet says, how many homes we can build and how much it's going to cost. And usually developers have a really, really sharp, carefully honed idea of how many parking spaces they need to make their project viable. They don't want to fail, as Commissioner Dodd mentioned. And so it's foolhardy of them to say, well, we're not going to do any because it costs a lot of money. We're just going to make a bunch of apartments, and hopefully they'll rent, because if they're going for a clientele, say a market rate clientele, they know they're going to have to put some parking in. So I'm up to I'm for leaving up to the purview of the developer in most cases, because I think they know what they need. And at the same time, we're seeing climate change rapidly occurring, all these floods this week. We're seeing that it's been pretty much well proven that parking invites car use invites traffic. If we can discourage that, or just at least not encourage it by creating, inviting people to use their cars, it's going to give us a safer roads and a nicer city as well. So just some thoughts on that. I tend to think that we should be a little more hands off as far as requiring parking, but many people have known that's my opinion for some time. So I wanted to start with that. Thanks.
Other commissioners? Commissioner Curd.
Thank you. Parking studies are a big topic here on this segment, and I'm kind of wondering what goes into a parking study, because there are so many variables that I can think of, and as Director Cotterman outlined, that can play into a parking study. And it's kind of the same thing as saying, like, how many crows can sit on a tree. There's so many different variables associated with that. I don't think that it can really be standardized. And so a parking study could be a tool to, it's just sort of like a pro forma that was done for Canyon Park. It's a tool to see one reality, but not necessarily to see every situation in every scenario. And so I think that sort of mandating a parking study is just adding on additional cost, as Commissioner Westerbeck alluded to as well. So I'm generally not in favor of mandating parking studies. That said, to go to these deeper levels of affordability, it could be used to justify that that scenario can exist and does exist. And so I'm not opposed to a parking study, but I think they have their uses in very limited circumstances. The other questions were about flexible, so flexible parking requirements is just justified by a parking study. I think we just make them flexible and we see what comes out of that. And we can always tweak the code. This is what's been done in the past too. We took a really conservative approach way back like a decade ago, and now we're seeing the negative impacts of that, and so it's time to adjust it. And the same thing can be always done. The city is always growing. Then the last question was about, let me see my notes here, need for third-party review. Again, I don't have a lot of trust in a parking study to be the only truth. And so I think that a third-party review is an even larger drain on resources that could be used to incentivize deeper affordability in other manners too. So those are my answers on this segment of questions.
Other commissioners? So I can see the potential conflicts here as well, allowing a reduction in the interests of increasing affordability by increasing costs. There's certainly some circular reasoning there. I would favor having reduction to a point being allowable just in the code. And then if there's an interest in driving it further, then allowing a study to justify that. Certainly going to a point, but beyond that, there needing to be a justification. Then that raises the question, what's that point? And we'll let you chew on that for a while. Third-party review. My question is, how standard are the methods for doing these studies? And if there is a pretty, if it's a matter of checking the math, then I'd be less inclined to require expert review. But if if it's fuzzier than that and does have a lot more judgment and therefore subject to a bit more pushing the margins, then perhaps the review would be warranted. And I got to say, I'm not familiar enough with these studies to be able to render a strong opinion on that. Is where I'd come down. Any other commissioner comments? Commissioner Dodd.
Thanks, Chair. I want to echo, I think, what Commissioner Kurtz said. I would like to see us err on the side of just making it a little more streamlined, definitely less onerous to develop these projects, pushing for deeper affordability. And then if we find that things go really weird in ways we didn't expect, then maybe we can revisit it later. But I do agree that I feel like to some extent, there's been a lot of like, oh, let's be cautious in Bothell, and I would like to see us try not to be so cautious. I don't think that we're just being like crazy and fancy free either, but I think it's good to just try something different to see if we get different results. I would hate for us to just be hesitant through a series of climate and housing crises. So that's kind of my take as well. If I'm summarizing your much more well-formed comments correctly. Thanks.
Other commissioner comments? Commissioner Alders.
Yes, Jenny Alders here. I really appreciate the comments of commissioners previously, mainly because you guys are representing perspectives that we've heard before, and it's important to make sure that we are applying those ideas to this conversation. And I am in agreement that we need to be able to make steps that work towards deeper affordability, that removes the restrictions. And to some extent the cautions and like the brakes that are put on housing affordability when we create codes and policies like this. I continue to think back to the motivations of keeping a city less accessible to people was strong in Bothell for a certain period of time. And we're moving away from that and seeing not only the negative impacts that has on affordability, but also on climate and on people's well-being and quality of life. So these conversations actually do help us move forward to a place where we can have more accessibility and inclusivity in our city. And that's why I am in support of my fellow commissioners here. So thank you.
Any other comments on this portion? Dave, you get Commissioner Westerbeck, is that a new hand up or a residual?
It is a new hand this time. Thank you, Commissioner Kiernan. I just wanted to add a few little things that, after hearing fellow commissioners speak. One thing I was involved recently in a study of how many affordable units could be generated for a site under a Bothell land use code for affordable housing, and the constraint, as is not unusual, was parking. And this particular feasibility study showed that almost twice as many affordable units, and this entity is shooting for around 60%, 50 to 60% AMI ideally, and maybe some units at 80% average median income. So pretty affordable units is the whole goal. Parking was the major reason we couldn't almost double the number of units in this study. And it was interesting to me that in our code, the senior and disabled code allows the 0.3 spaces per unit. And I understand that maybe the driving ratio is less for that demographic. But for what we call low income and very low income, we still require 0.75 spaces. Again, despite the fact that there's data showing in a lot of places car ownership is lower, among people with lower AMI. They rely on walking and transit and so forth more on bicycles. So I feel like there's a disconnect in our land use code about that. Low income and very low income should probably be at that 0.3 spaces per unit rate and not the 0.75, which is pretty generous. Again, there was studies a few years ago by a realtors organization, I think King County as well, showing that up to 40%, or average of something like 40% of the parking spots in market rate apartments around King County aren't used at 3 a.m. So we're over parking massively, and that includes a lot of apartment buildings in Bothell. And finally, the parking studies, I tend to agree with Commissioner Curd. They often seem dubious, and it seems like they can sort of, you can hire the firm that's going to give you the results you want. And they also assume, it seems like in my experience in the past, everyone's going to drive at a current rate, and they assume a lot of driving. And we're seeing driving go down significantly with younger people and newer generations. So we're seeing a decrease in driving. So again, this is sort of gets to that first question. Are we planning for now and how much people are driving now and how much they drove 5 years ago? Or are we going to be planning for how much driving we're going to see in 5 and 10 and 20 years? So I just want us to keep that in mind, that the parking studies might skew towards everyone's going to drive everywhere. And we're not seeing that anymore. So I just want to get those points made. Thank you.
And Director Cotterman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pose a question for a little bit differently for clarification from the commission, because I'm hearing comments that are, I think, addressing a couple of different situations. One that Commissioner Westerbeck just discussed, which are those projects that are specifically for low and very low income, that are designated already as affordable housing, and the costs that are added because of parking requirements or parking studies and the like. And I think that I think we've gotten direction from the commission on that as far as wanting to lower those costs as much as possible. The other part of the conversation that I'm hearing, though, is maybe making an assumption that if we apply this across the board and reduce parking requirements, that lowers the cost of development, which is true, but that doesn't necessarily lower the cost of the housing, because the developer may or may not pass those savings along in terms of rents. So I want to make sure that the commission is considering both of those situations and whether they want to treat them differently in terms of what our requirements are as far as parking.
Commissioner Dodd?
Thanks, Director Cotterman. I appreciate the distinction. I think my instinct is still to treat them the same at this point. I forgot the best way to say this, but I realize that not all developers would pass those savings on, but it also would allow more kinds of developers, including more local developers, to develop projects in these areas at that lower cost. And I would hope we would just see more of a diversity of development and just hopefully a different class of development. I would love to see what we get with this. And like I said before, and like I think Commissioner Curd said before, and I stole it. If it goes wrong, we can always correct course later. But I would love to try something a little different and hope we get something different versus more of the same. Thank you.
Commissioner Curd, I think I saw your card, and then Commissioner Gustafson.
I would defer to Commissioner Gustafson first.
Okay, Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Vice Chair Curd. We probably have some similar questions here, and I would ask, as always, Mr. Stanger to weigh in here. What do you think is going to get us the most affordable housing? And that's a really broad question. But let's focus on the market rate where the developers get to either pass on the savings to their tenants or not. What is more likely to get us more affordable housing? To let the developers do what they want, or to put in the affordability requirements?
In my opinion, the only way to assure that you're going to get the affordability or lower cost units when you reduce the cost of development is to require it.
Mm.
In the market that we have, and of course we don't know how long this superheated market will last, but where prices are driven by demand and growth of higher incomes, there's no reason for developers to compete on price.
Mm.
It's a little bit of an overstatement, but I think that's generally true.
And I would also add to that our recent policy has been wherever we either increase capacity or reduce development costs, that we do add affordable requirements, a certain percentage. So I think that's the direction we've been assuming we'll be going here, is that we will include some requirement, at least for projects that are big enough that, it's also applied generally to projects with 5 units or more. We'll get into that a little bit more. So unless there's a desire to deviate from that, I think that's the direction we've been assuming we'll be going with these.
Well, I think across multiple issues, there has been a broad interest among the commissioners in encouraging affordability and using incentives to do that. So I think, Dave, you're safe with that assumption. Other commissioner comments or questions? Commissioner Curd.
Thank you. And thanks for that point, Director Cotterman, about whether the costs of reduced parking will be passed on to the consumers of housing. And I would just say in response is that there are non-monetary costs of overparking as well. Every additional parking spot that is built in the city has an impact on the people who live here now. And it further incentivizes people to drive. And so if we were to, ban parking in all parts of the city, we would see our public resource, which would be street space and street parking, to be the area where the people who would be dependent on a car to naturally start to use as their parking. But we would quickly approach a maximum where the roads couldn't handle any more parking. And so what happens in that case, the market decides that people who have a car wouldn't choose to live in a place that doesn't have parking. And so when we add an overabundance of parking, there's so many other non-financial impacts to the surrounding community: traffic violence, additional delays in transportation and costs associated with shipping. I just think that parking has so many other sort of contingent and comorbidities that it gets back to that same point of like a parking study. How can it fully comprehend the impacts for an additional parking space? And so while I understand and I see that a developer may pocket the monetary benefit of reduced parking, I think that it comes with other benefits to the community as well. So,
Commissioner Gustafson.
Sarah Gustafson here. Thank you, Commissioner Curd, for starting to try to measure the externalities here of the parking requirement. I'm actually hoping to dig a bit more into the numbers on what this would actually cost the developer and what would be the potential affordable housing benefit to the city, so we can weigh costs and benefits. Just to throw out a scenario, let's say you had a market rate developer in the half-mile zone, and they wanted to go from, I think the current requirement for half-mile zone is 1 parking space per unit, or am I completely wrong here? Is it 1 parking space or 2?
It depends on the type of housing. So state code included both 1 space per bedroom and 0.75 spaces per unit, which to me always seemed to be flipped, but that's what the code is. And so we used that to allow, in some cases anyway, the reduction to 1 space per bedroom by right, and then the reduction to 0.75 per unit through a parking study.
Okay, so let me try to do this. So if we took from 1 space by right down to 0.75, that's a quarter. And then we say this parking space costs the developer $50,000 to create. That's about $12,500. And then you have a developer who builds like a 10-unit place. You're looking at a developer having to pay out $125,000 at the time of the building. What kind of affordable housing benefit would we expect from the developer if they were going to give up that requirement and be able to save that $125,000?
I guess you're waiting for me to answer. Commissioner Gustafson, that's exactly the kind of analysis that that we want to dig into. We've started, but we want to get into, the complexities of it a little bit but that's the route we're taking.
So the short answer is we don't know the answer to that yet, but that's something that we're looking for some guidance from the commission on these questions so that we can start that analysis.
Mr. Gustafson, continue.
Yes, I think, sorry, Sarah Gustafson here. Thank you, Chair. I think the analysis will be really, really important. I tend to lean towards the more libertarian view that Chair Kiernan said, that if you make things more expensive in the pursuit of making them more affordable, it's just circular and messy. But at the same time, I think we need to see whether the developers would be getting too much of a benefit or whether the city would be getting a lot of benefit. So let's crunch those numbers and give city council some good justifications for whatever we decide.
So Commissioner Dodd, haven't heard from you too much, and then Commissioner Westerbeck.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for waiting, Commissioner Westerbeck. So that analysis I'm also interested in, but I would love to have it, and sorry, Mr. Sanger, for adding this, but what Commissioner Curd was talking about with the costs that are not readily apparent, the environmental costs, the societal costs, that's a really important part of the analysis. So if we can touch on that beyond just the financials that Commissioner Gustafson talked about when we're looking at that, I think that would really help at least me personally get the full picture there. So just wanted to call that out as we're talking about future discussions. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Westerbeck.
Thank you. I know I've talked a lot. I wanted to briefly speak to Commissioner Gustafson's question about and which others have said you're researching about how that 125,000 might be used. With the particular feasibility study I mentioned that I was working on, because this entity is focused solely on creating affordable housing units. They are laser focused on if they could build literally 40 more units, so almost doubling the number of their units. They would actually do that if they were able to reduce their parking requirements. So they would actually save money on the parking, but they would still build more units and seek more money to build that number of units that the site zoning would allow, because right now they can't maximize the zoning. So to someone answer that question, as long as the resources are there, we would see affordable housing developers build as many units as they could without that constraint on the number of parking spaces, holding back the number of units, determining the number of units that can be made. So it doesn't speak to that $125,000 question so much as it just says, would you like a lot more affordable units that aren't held back by a parking requirement? Very tangible affordable housing gain for the city.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Director Cotterman.
I'd like to pose a question to the commission. And if we were in person, Dave would probably kick me under the table for asking this question, but I think I need to pose it. So we started this discussion with the commission, I believe last year, when we first were doing the code amendments that were required by state law. And at that time, the commission wanted to expand the housing reduction for market rate housing to a half mile. And that was the one piece that the staff asked the council to defer so that we could explore the possibility of requiring some affordable housing as a result of that reduction for market rate housing. What I think I'm hearing from the commission tonight, a sort of a consensus around that from the commission tonight, is you're basically where you were last year when we had this discussion, which is you just want to extend it to the half mile, reduce the parking requirement for market rate as well, and not have a requirement for affordable housing. And if that's the case, then we don't need to do any additional work, because the analysis is really about what that amount of affordable housing requirement would be if we did allow for that parking reduction. If you want to just apply it, then we can amend the code to allow it. and not worry about the affordability aspect of it. So, and I'm not trying to be contrary here, but that's kind of what I think I'm hearing. And I just want to find that out before we spend a whole lot of time doing some analysis that you may not need.
Commissioner Dodd.
Again, so I agree that is kind of where I'm at, except I would like to see those reductions, and then any further reductions would be tied to affordability. So I think there's a set of reductions that it seems like we're all kind of in favor of, just for market rate, just do it. And then if developers want to go further for affordability, I think that's where I would like to see analysis, if that's feasible. I don't know if I'm getting too in the weeds here, but
so if I could ask a clarifying question on that. So you're saying
course.
further for affordability, are you talking about if it's an affordable housing project and they want further reduction to allow for that, or that we would allow for additional reduction below the state requirement and require some affordability as part of market rate development? They're two different scenarios. And I don't mean to complicate this, but
I
want to make sure that we're following
Yeah.
some direction from the commission.
I think I would like to see just market rate housing have the most reductions we can see. And then if a developer says, hey, I can build some affordable units, if you let me do even less parking, that's where I'd want to see tied to affordability. Am I making sense? I'm not.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure if we would actually get that type of a request from a developer.
Gotcha.
Unless they're already building affordable housing, in which case they would be able to do additional units of affordable housing.
Well, yeah, I'm not seeing this as a request of the developer. I'm seeing this as a requirement of the developer if they are allowed to reduce their parking. And similar to the other affordability requirements that we've instituted, where a certain percentage of the units would need to be affordable at a certain level. So that's the direction we're going on, based on the direction we got from City Council when we took the previous amendments to them. So what I'm trying to do here is explore, and we could just keep it to that, but I'm trying to get a sense of whether there are other options that we can consider beyond just that, or and how we do that. I guess the one thing I'm hearing is pretty strong consensus that adding another expense like the parking study seems counterintuitive, and we can get back to you with some notion of what that expense would be. My only real experience with this before is with the Imagine Housing project, where when we raised that possibility, they basically said, well, yeah, we'll be doing a parking study anyway. Not all affordable housing developers maybe are going to have that attitude or have that already in their budget. So
Yeah, and sorry, I wanted to jump back in and say, I think I just misspoke a little bit. Obviously, a developer maybe not would ask for that, but just like reductions all around, and then a further level of reduced parking for more in exchange for more affordable units. Yeah, so that's kind of what I would like to hear from other commissioners too, because I don't want to speak for the whole body.
But thank you for clarifying that.
So Commissioner Gustafson, did I see you wanting to comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I apologize, Commissioner Dodd, for going like this with my hand. My concern is actually strategic here. We all have a consensus pretty much on what we want. As Director Cotterman said, we came to this consensus before we presented it to council. Council said no. And I'm wondering, what can we do to convince council? I was thinking that the analysis could help us build a really strong case for the council. So my question for Mike Cotterman is, do you think this analysis would be helpful in convincing council, especially now that we have a new council makeup, or are they just going to do what they do regardless of this analysis?
So I thank you for the question, because I want to be clear about this. The council did not say no. the council didn't go against the commission's recommendation per se. The staff asked that they defer a decision on this and not extend it to the half mile for market rate, because we wanted the opportunity to explore whether or not we could require additional affordable housing in exchange for that, for extending that to the half mile. So I'm not saying the council is against this at all, nor do I think they would be. I think whatever the commission wants to recommend to the council will give that due consideration. And they may or may not, go along with it. They may decide they want the affordability requirement for the additional, or they may go with the commission's recommendation for what, if we go with what Commissioner Dodd is suggesting, which is allow the market rate to go forward with this state equivalent reduction, and then require affordability for anything beyond that as far as parking reduction. So yeah, I don't want the commission to think we're in opposition to what any direction from the council at this point. We're also basing this on the council's previous policy direction to us, which Dave mentioned a little bit ago, which is wherever we reduce cost or increase capacity, we want to look for opportunities to require some affordable units. And that's primarily because of what Mike Stanger said, which is that's the only way that we get assurance that we will get additional affordable units. So that's the policy basis that we're operating under. But the commission can still recommend, whichever you think is the best direction to go to the council.
So I think what I'm hearing is the question of whether the benefits of reducing the externalities, as Commissioner Curd referred to them, around requiring parking are so great, we want it just in and of itself, or whether we should also leverage that reduction to get the additional benefit of affordable housing. Does that seem like the question we're wrestling with, Director Cotterman?
I believe so, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think that's part of the trade-off here. And I guess a question I have for Mike Stanger, and I don't know if you can answer this tonight, Mike. We can talk more offline, is just how much we can measure those externalities, the costs of, we certainly know what the externalities are. I think Commissioner Kerr did a good job of enumerating those. How much we can quantify those with a dollar value, I don't know. So that's something we'd have to take a look at.
I don't know either. As Mike Stanger, how well that can be done. But my thought is that the reasons that cities set minimum parking requirements is to stave off those externalities.
Okay, Commissioner Dodd.
Thanks, Chair. I'm pretty sure this is my last question, and it's for Director Cotterman. So you mentioned the council's policy position of whenever we make, reduce costs or whatever, that it's tied to affordable housing. Can you speak to, I might realize briefly, because I'm kind of springing this on you, how effective that's been in getting affordable units for the city?
Well, that's a very fair question. And I would say so far, since we've only been doing this for a couple of years, I'm trying to think if we have any projects that have come in that we have actually been able to. Help me out here, Dave. Have we? I don't think we've had any projects at this point where they've been subject to that mandatory provision. Is that correct?
Well, so the one that has taken advantage of a parking reduction is SAMA, the
Right.
Imagine Housing Project. But they were already planning to do very low and extremely low affordable senior and disabled housing. And we did that through a voluntary incentive that gave them an extra floor combined with a significant parking reduction. So I guess we're going to be bringing this back.
One quick thing on that, Dave, just to flip that around a little bit. If that was not proposed as an affordable housing project under our current code, even with that reduced parking, they would not have been required to do any affordable housing though. Is that correct?
Correct, because that particular section of the SR 522 district only has the voluntary incentive, no requirement.
So to get back to Commissioner Dodd's question, so far we haven't generated. They're relatively new provisions that we've been putting in the code. We're still building the ability to do that, but it's a good question.
So
And
one
it is
reason
limited.
one
ahead,
reason
Dave,
that
I'm sorry.
we wanted to bring this back to you, though, is that we really didn't have this conversation before. It wasn't until after the Planning Commission made the recommendation that we realized that we hadn't brought up this opportunity by going beyond the quarter mile for market rate housing, that we do have an opportunity to add a requirement. So that's what we really want to explore with you, and so it's not just going beyond, lower than the parking, but also expanding the radius. So, and like I say, we're gonna be coming back to you with some analysis. I think we owe it to ourselves, since we did raise this as something that the council should consider, to at least do the basic analysis on that, and then we can gauge whether we're hitting the mark or whether we need to go further or pull back on that.
Commissioner Westerbeck, then Commissioner Alders.
Thank you, Commissioner Kiernan. I just wanted to point out, it seems to me there's some agreement on the negative externalities that we're seeing parking bringing, climate change, flooding, increased traffic fatalities. There are a lot of them that we're noticing more and more. It seems like we've got a lot of tools in the toolbox as a city to use other incentives besides parking. We could say you automatically get, just as Director Cotterman said, you automatically get the reductions. If you want affordable housing, you can apply for more reductions. But, or we say you can have them, you can have your reduced parking. We're not going to use that as a tool, but we would like to incentivize you to do affordable housing. If you're going to do more market rate, if you do more affordable, we'll let you look at this other array of incentives that we offer. And I know we've discussed them in other planning commission meetings, MFTE and density addition, bonuses and all kinds of things. Maybe we look at impact fees, who knows. If it's an important enough for us as a city to incentivize affordable housing and this is a really dire hair on fire problem throughout the country and acute in our region. We really, really desperately need affordable housing, workforce housing. We can get creative and find other incentives besides parking, which has been around as an incentive for a long time. Maybe it's time for us to say, it's just it's too expensive. The negative externalities now to have parking used as a bargaining chip. Let's look at other incentives instead that we can offer as a city. So I just think it's time for us to be broadening that incentive scope. Thanks.
Commissioner Alders.
Thank you, Chair. I sense that there is a struggle among the commissioners to really almost define the problem that we're trying to address here. And so in order for me to better understand sort of where the mismatch is, it sounded like Director Cotterman, that when you were describing incentives that exist and the programs that have been in place for the last couple of years, that you mentioned that there were affordable housing requirements somewhere in the city. As far as I understand, there aren't. So if I'm missing that information, that's I would like to correct my understanding. And because if there are, then how can we replicate that? If there aren't, then is that the question we are answering here tonight? Is the question then, should there be mandatory? And is this the first time we would then, as a commission, be recommending mandatory affordable housing? If there was, or is this an incentive? Anyway, please clarify. I appreciate it.
Certainly. No, thanks for the question. So no, this is not the first time that the commission has recommended mandatory affordable housing. There were code amendments that came through 2 years ago, Dave, for the downtown transition zone, where we increased the 522 corridor, where we increased the capacity. Just recently, on the 522, the general downtown, the GDC zone, where we allowed for additional height. There's a mandatory provision that goes with that. Canyon Park, where we reduced the parking requirements, there's a mandatory provision that goes with that. So those are all relatively recent, within the last 3 years.
And also the 522 corridor affordable housing overlay, where
Right.
we changed from general commercial to 522. Those all are mandatory areas.
Right. So any of those changes we've done in the last 3.5 years, where we have added capacity, or in the case of Canyon Park, we reduce costs through the reduced parking requirements, that is something that we're allowed under state law and case law to put in a mandatory provision for affordable housing as a result of that. Any time that we require affordable housing, we have to be providing some benefit to the developer as well. So that's one of the areas in the article that I forwarded to you that Commissioner Westerbeck identified. I had an email exchange with him about that, because there was one part of that I pushed back on, which is the policy of in the article it stated we shouldn't be leveraging reduced parking for affordable housing. We should just require affordable housing. Well, in this state, we can't do that. We have to provide some benefit for that. So that's why we have tried to take advantage of that wherever we can. And that was the policy direction from the council. The incentive that we have currently is the multifamily tax exemption. So they're not required to use that, but it is available to them, and it's an incentive to provide affordable housing with the project. The TDR program that we're talking about in Canyon Park is an incentive program that we would make available through the transfer of development credits from the Sound Transit site to other sites within Canyon Park. They would be able to buy those credits and use them to develop additional units, some of which would be affordable. So that's more of an example of an incentive program. So we do have both, but I would say our tools are limited in both cases. We don't have as broad of a spectrum of ways to either provide incentives or certainly put mandatory provisions in place. We're more limited on the mandatory side. There are other incentives that we could be looking at. I hope that answers your question.
I have a follow-up question, which is, thank you for the clarification on that. So mandatory incentives do exist, which is kind of strange to say that a mandatory incentive exists, but
it's not an incentive.
It's not an incentive.
It's mandatory. It's not an incentive.
Okay, thank you. But it's a decision. It's a choice that they can make. That if they make that choice, it's mandatory.
No. In the case of mandatory, so for example, where we have increased the height,
yes,
then they can build an additional story, and as a result of that, they can add units. And
That's
some
their
of those
choice.
units, it's a choice. But if they don't use that height and they develop, they still have to provide the same number of affordable units, whether they use that or not. That's
Same
why.
percentage.
Thank you.
Yes, that's
Thank you.
the
Okay.
difference. Yeah.
Now, my follow-up question, then, thank you for the clarification, is then how many developments since those have been enacted have we seen the mandatory affordable housing be included in their plans?
We haven't had any yet that have occurred in those areas where we've been able to apply that mandatory provision.
And that's partly because the areas where we've done it, we're kind of working around the edges. Those are the areas where we had the opportunity to increase capacity within the planned action environmental impact statement. And they're probably not the most attractive development opportunities in downtown. The places where we've seen the most development in downtown are areas where we already allowed 65-foot development. So when we did the downtown plan, we didn't feel that there was a nexus to add an affordability requirement. What we didn't consider back then was that we also did reduce the parking. So we probably could have, so now we are doing some catch up there. And sometimes these mandatory requirements or incentives, either way, it can take a while for those to take effect. I think the city of Redmond had them in place for 10 years, wasn't it, Mike, before the conditions changed to see that actually happen?
Yeah, it does take time. And something else to keep in mind. So in Canyon Park, the reason we went with the parking reduction to include the mandatory provision was because we already had we had no limit on density, basically. So we couldn't add density to get a mandatory affordability provision. The only way we could do that was by reducing development costs through the parking standards. So we've had to be a little creative in some areas as well. I hope that's helpful.
So at this point, I do have like 3 more slides with sets of questions. We can go ahead and plow through that this evening, or we could bring this back on as early as December 15th. We won't have any sort of full analysis on the affordability question, but we can continue this discussion certainly.
I think I do see us bumping up against our 9 o'clock time. If we are to carry over, Dave, do you think it's best to just carry over all 3 items, or do you want to shoot for 1 more and then carry over 2?
Well, how about this? How about if I kind of quickly touch on all 3, and then you can decide which ones you want to, if you want to tackle any of them tonight, or just defer them all to the next session.
That sounds good. So let's hold our questions. Let's let Dave get through this and then kind of ponder as a group whether there, and I suspect there will be enough that we'll have to come back to it anyway. So let's carry on. So Dave, share your screen.
Okay, I think this is where we left off. Yes. Okay, so here's another question. If we're allowing, with the parking study, further reductions than what we've allowed to date, could we also consider those in downtown and Canyon Park? Currently, those codes already factored in transit. In the downtown, we factored in transit when we established the parking requirements, and in Canyon Park, we also factored the parking reductions into the existing affordability requirements. But at least in downtown, we have had requests for further reductions, and we really don't have a mechanism for doing that. So part of these code amendments could be to provide that mechanism. If you want to go beyond what our requirement is now, you could do that through a parking study, for example. And additional reductions could leverage additional affordable housing without adding capacity. So that's one set of questions. And then another is, should we consider projects beyond the half-mile buffer, as was raised earlier, that maybe there is some justification for that. And we've had, and I bring up again that some of the downtown stops could be consolidated, and perhaps we wouldn't have as full a coverage with that consolidation. The other thing I wanted to show here is two of the proposed planning code amendments that we got, or one is a plan and code amendment, one is just a code amendment, but both are requesting parking reductions, and they're both just outside those half-mile radii. So the one along Bothell Everett Highway, if we did allow it based on future Swift line, then maybe we'd be okay. Whether we're going to get future frequent transit into North Creek to serve the nearly 1,000 units being built on the old Seattle Time site, I don't know. And their request is just for a parking reduction, but we would, at least our initial approach would be to include some sort of affordability requirement with that. And then this is a little bit of an outlier, but this is in reaction to an issue that came before us. But should we consider parking reductions beyond multifamily housing? Now, currently, our single-family housing requirement is 3 spaces per unit. If you add an ADU, you add another space. When we discussed duplexes on corner lots in single-family zones, we did apply a reduction within a half-mile of frequent transit. Should we be doing that in cases of single family or single family with ADUs? And when you get down to that small level, maybe it's not possible to add a affordable housing requirement, since we typically do those for projects of 5 units or more. But maybe that's a case where we say, okay, that's just going to be naturally occurring affordable housing, which has been our approach for ADUs, is we limit the size and they'll tend to be more affordable. And perhaps there are some others that will come up, or that commissioners will want us to pursue as we go forward. With that, this is where I was going to end and have a discussion about the overall presentation and clarifications, further discussion, and discuss the next meeting. We would like to keep this as simple as possible, but this is a complex issue, and it gets complex quickly. So this is an image that just popped up today from, I believe, from Edmonds. I thought would be a good one to end the discussion on tonight. So.
All right, thank you, Dave. So I see us with about 9 minutes scheduled. We can always extend, but my feeling is we are not going to complete discussion of this evening. And I see a couple of heads nodding. So I see some vigorous heads nodding. So would we need a motion for this, Director Cotterman, or just a sense of the body that let's carry it over? And
just a consensus of the commission, Mr. Chair. This is not a public hearing, so there's no formal continuation required.
So, I mean, kind of carry over. I'm seeing. I think you've got a consensus there. I don't Yeah, we would not get through this evening in a measured, thoughtful way. So let's give it the time it deserves.
So hopefully
So
I've given you some enough to chew on that we can have, continue a good productive discussion next time.
I think you certainly have, and I think many of, if not all of us, have also read the governing link that went through about parking. So we're thinking about this. And Mike Stenger, thanks for coming and helping us with this. I have to make a comment. If you orient just right, it looks like the Space Needle is behind you with that light.
Yeah.
But I had to do a double take initially. What kind of view does he have? But so thank you. With that, I think we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is unfinished business. And Director Cotterman, do we have some unfinished business?
We do, Mr. Chair. Just one item. So this is about the walking tour that Commissioner Curd brought up at the last meeting. He and Dave have been working on some of the details for that. So thank you, Commissioner Curd, for the map and the work. And thanks to BOPOP for putting this together initially. And we're going to plagiarize what BOPOP did with the tour. So we were talking about the December 4th date. That's a Saturday. We had sort of settled on doing this on a Saturday, and we wanted to make sure we could get all the commission there. And we also wanted to invite the city council. So I found out today that there is a training that day, and Commissioner Aldrich probably knows about this now, that the Association of Washington Cities is putting on for returning and newly elected council members. And I know that there are some council members that are interested in that. We're not, obviously, this is not based on requiring council members to be there. We can't do that, but we want to make sure that we provide the opportunity. And if there's a conflict, we want to try to avoid that. So I wanted to bring this to the commissions tonight to talk about and see if you would like to move that date and to make sure that the next date we had in mind, which is the 11th, the following Saturday, 1 to 3 p.m. is the time frame that we're looking at, if that would work for the commission. And obviously I'll follow up with Commissioner Robson since she's not here this evening. So I'd like to get some feedback from the commission about that date, and then using the 18th as our backup in case we have some more wild and woolly weather on the 11th.
So commissioners, I see one thumbs up. I see some quizzical looks, a thumbs down, a thumbs up.
Clarification, you said December 11th is the day you're proposing?
Correct. That would be
Okay.
our first choice would be the 11th.
And it's afternoon because there's the wine and spirits walk. Some of us have tickets for it when you mentioned that already.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the benefits of doing it on that Saturday. Is
Yeah.
you could just roll
Thanks.
right into that.
It's all coming together. Fine with me.
Roll may not have been the right word there, but yes,
That comes later.
yeah.
So
But I'm seeing one no, and again, we'll check on Commissioner Robson. But if we want to get the entire commission there, we need to look at a different date.
okay. And then looking at the 18th. What are people thinking about that?
I'm saying thumbs up because I can do both.
Yeah, and I can do both as well. We are
Okay.
closing in on the holidays, but
Yeah, that's week before Christmas. Dave, does the 18th work for you? You're-
Commissioner Dodd
make
is
that work.
puzzling.
It does work. I have tickets to Christmas tea at Graham's Royal Tea, but it's at 11 a.m. So I should just be able to roll right into the walk. So
You'll be fortified with tea and
I will
crumpets or
be
whatever.
peak British.
Exactly.
You'll have both a pre-function and a post-function.
Does the
So-
18th work for you, Dave?
Yes.
I haven't checked the 18th yet. Let me.
And
That's the start of vacation, but I have no plans at this point.
same with me.
Sorry. Or maybe that's good.
It's always a treat to spend time with all of you, so I'm not worried about that.
Oh,
No, I mean that. I enjoy these.
We might need to provide hot cider to keep ourselves warm, but then we'll like make it a little festive and enjoy our time together.
So
I was
I
going to
think
suggest mulled wine, but since it's a formal meeting, I don't think we can do that.
that can come at 3:10.
Yes.
So I think that looks good. Let's
Okay.
pencil it in or put it into our calendars digitally and assume it's good unless we hear otherwise. And then you'll notify the council, and as interested, they may participate.
We will invite the council, both current and incoming council members. And again, they may or may not participate, but we'll certainly make them aware of that. And that will be advertised as a potential quorum of the council as well. So that we've got that covered. We've already had conversations with the city clerk about that. And this will be advertised as a special meeting of the Planning Commission.
And presumably open to the public if they wish to tag along.
Absolutely open to the public, yes.
Okay.
There will be no deliberation or decisions made by the commission during this walk.
No motions, no actions.
No
All right.
actions. The only action will be walking and just general conversation.
All
Chair,
right.
if I could jump in really quick too, just to add that some of the most of the walking tour that we have routed out, that I've worked with Dave to route out, is mostly on sidewalks, but there are some places where there are no access ramps. And so the public should be aware.
So accessibility may be challenged at points.
We'll ask them to let us know if they have any mobility issues that we need to be aware of.
Thanks.
And we'll do our best to accommodate that then. So this also means then that I'm assuming if we do it on the 18th, if that's the date we're targeting, we wouldn't have a backup date necessarily. So our backup date would probably be sometime in January at that point, I assume. But we should probably have one in mind at least, so that if we do have some unhospitable weather, shall we say, that day, that the commission, we can let everyone know who's there, that it's continued to some date certain. But we can figure that out later.
Okay. I see we're coming fast up on 9 o'clock. We have a couple of, I think, quick items to finish up. But do I have a motion to extend the meeting perhaps 10 minutes so that we can complete? Commissioner Curd.
So moved.
Is there a second? Commissioner Dodd.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to extend the meeting till 9:10 so that we can complete our business this evening. Any discussion around that motion? Seeing none, all in favor? And I see all of us in favor. So we're extending the meeting until 9:10. Was there any other unfinished business, Director Cotterman?
No more unfinished business, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So reports from staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two quick items. I'm sorry, one quick item. Just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of the Meet the City Manager Candidates Forum that's set for 6 p.m. on the 29th of this month. That will be a virtual opportunity to meet the candidates. As I understand it, there are 4 candidates. We still don't have any names or information on them, but those will be released sometime before that date. This will be an opportunity to hear them. I think they'll have a few minutes to do brief presentations, and then there will be questions posed to them based on questions that were previously received when we did surveys about what folks were looking for in a city manager. And then there will be a brief survey available to participants to fill out after that. And then the council will be doing the current council with new council members coming in. We'll be doing the interviews, final interviews of those on the 30th is my understanding. And I don't know, Dave, if you had any announcements, but that's all I had tonight, Mr. Chair. He was muted, but I read his lips. He said he didn't have anything.
I caught that as well. All right, time for reports from members. Commissioners, anything to share? Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah Gustafson here. First, I did want to mention the city manager town hall as well. Director Cotterman, do you know if there's any cybersecurity measures? Because it's an open link and I was a little concerned about Zoom bombing, even though I hope nothing like that would happen at a.
That we'll certainly be watching for that. The city clerk will be managing the meeting. It'll be a webinar, very similar to what we used tonight. So only people that are paneled in will be able to present anything. So I think that would present any Zoom bombing.
Great, thank you. Perfect. Other announcement is that I heard that Commissioner Curd is doing a geology walk at One Bothell, and that is the 27th, I believe, at 10 a.m. At Blythe Park. So please keep us posted. And then the third thing is congratulations to Commissioner Alders on the election to City Council.
Did Commissioner Curd invite planning commissioners to that meeting? Do we need to post potential quorum?
I did not specifically invite planning commission, but if there's interest, I guess.
It just let us know if we're going to have. Thank you. I hadn't heard about that, so I'd like more information.
Yeah, I'd be interested as well. All right, Commissioner Dodd.
It's about Commissioner Curd's thing. So I'm going to that. Sounds like Chair Kiernan might go. But if we're talking about geology and not planning, is there an actual problem?
That's a good question. I will ask.
Okay.
Yeah, we may be okay. As you know, we'll make sure you're all on. You know, we trust you to all be on good behavior and not talk about planning commission items when you're out there. But I will confirm that with our deputy city attorney just to make sure.
I can promise not talking about planning, but not good behavior.
All right, Commissioner Alders.
Thank you, Commissioner Gustafson. That is, yep, I will be involved in future city council decision making, and thank you for mentioning that tonight. But when it comes to the geology activity that Karsten is doing, my kids have actually been really excited for an event like this for quite a while, so we would like to attend. And if we can keep, if we can get clarification, I would like to make sure that that is an opportunity available to us. So thank you, Commissioner Curd, for being involved in our community and sharing your geological wisdom with us all.
And let me just be clear, I don't want to discourage anyone from going on Commissioner Curd's rock tour. That has a different connotation. That didn't come out quite right. I apologize. Geology tour. Thank you. So whoever wants to go, certainly by all means go. I'll just make sure that if we do need to do a notice that we take care of that. So don't be at all concerned about that.
Okay. Great. Other reports from members? Seeing none. So Commissioner Curd, there was an interest in your tour. Perhaps you can email Director Cotterman who could share.
Yeah, or just, I guess, whoever is still listening at 9:05 at night to the Planning Commission meeting or on YouTube in the future. The walk is hosted by One Bothell. It is a community organization based here in Bothell, mainly focused on stewardship of the lands which were formerly known as the Wayne Golf Course. The walk that I'm hosting is at 10 a.m. on Saturday, November 27th. We're meeting at the flagpole at Blythe Park, and then we'll be walking on some kind of dirt paths and trails. It's not too arduous of a journey, and families and or pets that are leashed, the pets are leashed, not the families, are allowed and welcome. And there's bike parking. If you haven't been to Blythe before, there's bike parking by the restrooms. It's right on the trail. And yes, please come and join us on this little walk.
And how long of a walk do you anticipate? What's the time?
Yeah, it's, I think we have a hard limit at 90 minutes, but it may take less time depending on if people have no questions, and I'm really good at explaining things.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So any other reports from members? Seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn this evening's meeting? Commissioner Dodd first.
I move to adjourn the meeting.
And Commissioner Alders, would you like to second?
I second the motion.
All right, it's been moved and seconded that we adjourn tonight's meeting. All in favor, please indicate. I see all commissioners indicating affirmatively that we adjourn the meeting. So the November 17th meeting of the Planning Commission is adjourned this evening at 9:07. Thank you all, and we'll see you, if not walking with geology, then at our next meeting. Y'all have a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you all. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thanksgiving.
Take
Good to see
care.
everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.